One week from today could be one of the biggest trade deadlines in Winnipeg Jets history. What are they going to do in between then, and what can we expect from a team that, quite frankly, is a little bit quiet at the moment? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode. I am your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, it is a big weekend and upcoming week for the Jets. It is the trade deadline eve, if we're being honest. 7 days from now, the trade deadline will kick in, and Winnipeg has been quietly, at least on the surface, making some moves. Now, we don't quite know what they are yet. We don't really know what the Jets are targeting, but we're hearing all sorts of reports either way, and we are trying to figure out what's real, what is the usual Jets obfuscation, and where will Winnipeg end up in the next 7 or so days, right? Winnipeg has a really good chance to take advantage of a market that's all over the place and a league that, quite frankly, is not as good as it's been in the past. The playoff field is weaker. This is a fantastic opportunity for the Jets to come away with something special that puts them really over the top. But before they even get there, of course, there is still business to take care of. The Jets are trying to win not only the President's Trophy, but also secure home ice advantage throughout the playoffs. And I want to chat about, this upcoming game against the Flyers in just a brief moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now, obviously, coming into this weekend game, the Jets are in a pretty good position. I know the last game they did lose to the Preds, and it does feel a little bit bitter for the Jets, but I think, you can probably at least excuse some of it thanks to injuries and, some fatigue kind of settling in. Our bottom six has maybe seen better days. We've had a few depth guys who have kind of come in and out, and, the Jets, I think, just sort of ran out of steam. 3 games in 4 nights is a lot for most teams, even the Jets. And, this is a good opportunity for the Jets to kind of reset. They're coming back home. It'll be a weekend game. Thankfully, you've had a day off in between. And I think the Jets should come away comfortably with a big win against Philadelphia. Now, what makes the Flyers especially interesting is that this team has been one of the ones that the Jets have really been linked to the past couple of days. I don't really read too much into the links because I think that while they are real in some capacity, I don't think that they are plan A. I think, the stuff that the Flyers have is more like a plan C kind of situation. If we are to believe what some of the rumors are, the Jets have generally been trying to shop for bigger fish. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the latter parts of this episode. I think that there's some real interesting stuff for the Jets to come away with. But up front for the Flyers, let's focus on them first. They've got Forster, Cates, and Brink on their top line, Kuzmenko, Lawton, and Konechny on the second line, Tippett, Couturier, and Michkov on the third, Pelletier, Paling, and Delorier on the fourth. So you look at this team and you kind of understand why the Flyers have not really been all that high in the Metro Division. It's bad. I don't know how else to say this. It is just, there's not a lot of skill here. You have a lot of rookies coming in, trying to really improve the situation, a lot of young players, and a mixture of some veterans that are perhaps being played a little bit too high in their current roles. This team just doesn't really have much to work with. And I think in that respect, it's maybe a little bit reminiscent of the Jets in previous years. I think Winnipeg has always had a slightly better roster than this. This is like early Jets 2.0 vibes, right? And I think for, Winnipeg, after having a tough loss against, Nashville, they're going to look to really take advantage of a Flyers team that just doesn't have much of a punch. If you look at the third line, I would honestly say that like the third line might honestly have more skill than most of the lineup across the board. So this to me feels like a pretty clear cut victory. That hasn't always been the case, but if there's one thing that I do feel the Jets do this year better than previous years, it's beat up on weak teams. And you look at the Flyers defense and you also kind of realize, yeah, they're not really working with a lot. You've got York and Sandheim on the first, Sealer and Drysdale on the second, and Zamula and Ristolainen on the third. I would say that like the right side of this defense, it's not bad. You know, there's some interesting talent there. They've got some guys who are currently being shopped on the market. And so it's not the worst blue line, but I just feel like this team, especially for what the Flyers used to be and how they've kind of devolved into this really chaotic organization, I don't really feel like they have a clear direction. You know, Mitchkov can't always get on the same page with the coaching staff. Couturier, you know, he's a guy that at one point was, you know, taken right after Scheifele and really one of the biggest names in the league, and injuries have kind of derailed a lot of his career. And you look at Scott Laughton playing second line minutes. You've got Konechny basically being surrounded by lots of middle six players. You know, it's just a weird situation all around, and I just can't imagine how the Flyers front office really plans to try and fix this. The Jets have been a rumored trade partner for a while now, whether it's, you know, somebody like Laughton or Ristolainen. I don't think Winnipeg is really interested in this avenue all that much. Not that it's, you know, inconceivable. I just don't really feel like it's all that likely. Given what the Jets are probably shopping for and what the market still has available, I just don't think the Flyers are going to be satisfied, A, with what Winnipeg is offering, and B, I just think the Jets want to shoot higher than this. Laughton is a fine bottom six player, and that's basically it. I don't even know if he's really an improvement on what Winnipeg already has. Maybe on the box scores, sure, but beyond that, probably. If anyone would really be an upgrade that's been, you know, linked to the Jets, it's maybe Rasmus Ristolainen. And like, I don't really see Ristolainen's game and get instantly excited. Is he mobile beef? Yes. You know, I think he's defensively better than he was in previous years. I do think that there's suggestions that he could actually improve Winnipeg's third pairing, but like, you know, he's got another couple of years on his contract. He's, you know, at a cap hit of about $5 million. Unless he's kind of replacing Neal Pionk on the second pairing, I just don't really see a world where he really makes a lot of sense for the Jets. I certainly would not be trading a first round plus for him. I think that he's a solid depth defender, but beyond that, I don't really feel like the Jets should be investing a lot of futures and assets into a package that includes him. So, you know, for Winnipeg, I think that, you know, they're in an interesting spot. This Flyers team is weak. They're rebuilding, and there are players there who are of interest, but none that I think they want to personally trade away. So I think this game for the Jets, you know, even though there's some trade intrigue and stuff, I think Winnipeg will easily handle this. I wouldn't really expect too much to come out of this game in the coming days. I'm sure the Jets scouts will be watching closely, but, you know, in terms of like actual players to trade for, unless you find a way to make Couturier work or something like that, I think Winnipeg would be better served shopping elsewhere. The only other name that would be of interest is maybe Travis Sanheim, but like, I doubt the Flyers are really intending to trade him. So Winnipeg, if they don't win this game, I'm sure they'll be a little bit disappointed. Personally, I really won't be that upset. The Jets are at this point already at such a great, point in the standings where I don't really care if they drop a couple of results. But, on home ice, it would probably be nice to come away with a win. So I'm predicting a 4-1 victory. Drop your score predictions in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, amidst all of this, I did mention in the previous episode that the Jets are trying to re-sign Neal Pionk, and I want to chat about that for a little bit in just a brief moment. My personal feelings are that in many ways it's not going to end well for the Jets. But before we talk about why, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can always stay up to date on the latest and greatest action in all basketball fandom. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Obviously, Luka Doncic with LeBron just starting to gain chemistry. It's going to take a few games, but if you think that this is enough to take the Lakers to a major championship, this is a good time to get in on the action right now. Put down a couple of bucks, right? All you have to do is put down $5, and if that $5 bet wins, you can get $150 in bonus bets. Again, if you're a new customer and you bet that $5 and it wins, that's $150 in bonus bets to take those Laker winnings and turn it into something even bigger. That's all at FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about quite a bit of stuff this coming week. Obviously, we are just about 7 days away from the NHL trade deadline. And for the Jets, I think that this is a particularly interesting time period. They're trying to negotiate contract extensions, perhaps make some trades, and figure out what the future of this team looks like while still trying to bring in some talent to help the present core just get that little bit further. And we've heard a lot about what the Jets are going to use or try to, use for trade bait, who they're after. We've heard a lot about maybe different scenarios for the trade situation if they don't go big or if they go small. I think that there's all sorts of options for Winnipeg. And amidst all of this, one of the biggest questions that I think really faces or really informs the future of this team is kind of what they do with Neal Pionk. And I know that sounds a little bit silly. Pionk is, at this point in his career, a solid second pairing defender who has enough defensive warts to where, he's asking probably in the neighborhood of $6 to $7 million. And for me, I just look at this contract and I think almost right off the bat, I feel like it's going to be a mistake. Pionk's 29, and I think as a second pairing guy alongside Sandberg, that pairing has been at times Winnipeg's best defensive pairing, right? Sandberg and Pionk do feed off of each other, but I think, somebody in our last episode was talking about how I was really focusing on Stanley and didn't really criticize Sandberg and Pionk. First off, I will say that I don't think that some of the goals that we saw conceded were actually really on the defense. And if it was Stanley in front of goal, I probably would have said the same thing. Like the first Forsberg goal was just not great from Comrie. The second goal was actually more on Lowry, kind of cruising behind the net, skating himself into trouble with possession, and that forced a turnover right in front of Comrie that no one really had a chance to react to. So I think in a lot of ways, maybe last game wasn't the best example, but what I often see with this pairing in other games is like Sandberg sometimes turns the puck over along the wall and stuff, which is actually a pretty common Jets problem. But I think the other issue is that he doesn't really have a partner that he can reliably send the puck to. Pionk is a lot of fun offensively, and especially when he's dropping below the faceoff circles. But in the defensive zone, he is he is chaos incarnate. Pionk kind of gives as much as he often receives, and I think that that's a really difficult position to be in when you're looking at a contract that's going to start with like a 6 or a 7. I don't really feel that there's any way that it goes below that unless Pionk takes some sort of a pay cut, but with the cap going up and, the Jets being known as an organization that tends to reward veteran loyalty and stuff. I just think that, on top of his points production, Pionk is due for a big raise. And while I do like his personality, I think his locker room fit is ideal. I think in terms of the kind of guy he is, there's really no complaints there. It's the on-ice stuff that I continue to really have issues with. Pionk is very good offensively and kind of awful defensively. And the defensive stuff is bad enough to where I just wonder how much value you're really getting out of him. It's the same sort of conversation we used to have about Kyle Connor coming into this season where, like, Connor is one of our most gifted finishers, but because of the way that he cheats for offense, or at least did in the past, it kind of nullified a lot of what made him good. The lack of defensive back checking and marking kind of left his line in a really big hole. I think a lot of the reason the Jets top line this year has been at least, 50% in most games is because KFC himself really changed the way that he defensively transitioned and tried to create offense out of defense. He did more man marking, he did more back checking, he forced more turnovers. That stuff I think has really had a tangible impact. With Pionk, I don't really think that there's much to his game that's going to drastically improve. I think he is what he is. He's a solid number 5 who does have some nice shooting ability. He's got some good passing, but the elements of chaos under pressure and in the defensive zone, to me, kind of put him in a tier of player where, as like a $4 million or $5 million guy, I don't really complain as much. But if you're asking for 6+, I just don't think that really serves the Jets in the present or future. And as much as I do enjoy his personality, and I think that he's a guy who's really been accountable for many years, I think that this to me is like a bridge that you just can't cross. If you go over it, you're probably going to be looking at a buyout here in a much shorter time frame than you'd expect. I think in his early 30s, Pionk's game is going to rapidly decline. We're already seeing him kind of on a downward slope, and I know that the points may say otherwise to people, but if you actually look at the underlying metrics, some of the microstats tracking, and also just visually observe how pace in this game is kind of putting him at a disadvantage, you start to understand that his situation is a little more complicated. Sandberg is like the only guy who's been able to get Pionk really good results. There's no other defender on this team that puts Pionk in positive territory. And I think that that's also really a big testament to just how good Sandberg is, that, Pionk, apart from him, is just not the same player. And so I really get worried about the Jets trying to fit this big contract. And apparently, Winnipeg has been very aggressive with Pionk's agent. I think what I am quietly hoping for, and I don't want to, I'm not trying to say this to be snarky or anything, but I feel like it's just better for the Jets if Pionk walks in free agency. I love the service that he's done this for this team, and I think I'll always be grateful for that. But I think long term, Winnipeg's defense just needs an overhaul. Sandberg and Morrissey are at this point kind of on an island. DeMello seems to be declining. Miller is a good third pairing guy, and that's probably about as high as you want him playing. You've got Stanley, Hanela, Coughlin, Fleury, and Lundmark, and yeah, none of those guys are probably top 4. Hanela maybe, but we don't really know with him. With the rest, I think Coughlin has some ability as a third pairing guy. I like him a lot, and I think that he actually should be in the NHL right now. I'm a little bit surprised that he's not, but everyone else I'm kind of not really seeing a long-term role for. If the Jets are to get some improvement internally, it's going to be a guy like Elias Salamonson. Salamonson, I think, is legitimately a top pairing potential kind of guy, but we don't really know what he'll actually do until he makes the league. And with the Jets' development schedule and how they often handle their defensive prospects, I am not really holding my breath for that to be a particularly near-term thing. But maybe they prove me wrong. Maybe next season he gets some sort of a deployment on the third pairing. I just worry that, that's going to be right behind Neal Pionk. And at Pionk's, age and this stage of his career, it's just not the kind of player that I want to commit money in term to. I even have these concerns about Kyle Connor. Connor has finally put together one of the best seasons of his career in all facets of the game. And I don't know if it's the kind of thing that's a flash in the pan or if it's here to stay. If it's here to stay, hand him a blank check. But if it's not, I don't really know that I like the idea of him pushing 10, 11, 12 million. That's a lot of cash for a guy who may end up being a little bit of a one-dimensional shooter. My hope is that that's not what happens, and I think that with the coaching staff kind of changing how some of these players really approach the game, that this version of KFC is the one that you get going forward. And if it is, that's awesome. The good news is that we have at least another year to find out, so I'm not going to worry about that too much right now, but with Pionk, his extension's coming up. The Jets are apparently very interested in bringing him back. Yeah. As much as I would like his personality fit, I don't think that the actual on-ice performance right now is, justification enough. He does well alongside Sandberg, but you can't just sign a guy to only work with one defensive partner. They just have to be good in general. And that's where I think Pionk hasn't always met expectations. He's even said at times that he's felt embarrassed by his own performance. Do I feel like that's really harsh? Kind of, I may kind of lose my mind watching him turn the puck over near Hellebuck, but I don't really feel like the shame and stuff should be, a part of how these guys view their own games. Unless they're just actively being horrible people, like that kind of thing, I just don't really subscribe to. So, whatever happens with Pionk, I will, happily remember him kind of pocketing McDavid during the bubble year. That was a lot of fun to watch. And if he ever finds a way to rediscover that form, that would be fantastic. So let me know your thoughts on the Pionk extension. Is it something that you're after? Are you kind of wary about it in the same way that I am? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Wrapping us up tonight, I did want to chat a little bit about the upcoming trade deadline and some suggestions from Friedman and others about what the Jets are after. Some of it will be a little bit different than we've heard. Others perhaps maybe not as new. We'll cover all of that, though, in just a brief second. Before we go any further, though, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Trade Coffee. If you're like me, your mornings have to have a good start with a good cup. And I've gotten tired of grocery store brands. A lot of them are watery, very thin, just not that tasty. That's why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, this coffee is next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the U.S., bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or you're an experienced veteran, they'll handpick the perfect match just for you. I've honestly thought, with all the Maxwell houses out there and a lot of these basic coffees, you need something a little bit tastier. If you've ever had organic Costa Rican coffee, let me tell you, it is to die for. And Trade helps connect you to roasters just like that here in the States. They've got plenty of options, tons of beautiful roasts, stuff that works well, whether it's lighter or darker. It's tasty. And if you don't love your first bag, no worries. Trade will replace it for free until they get it just right. We even have a special offer for all of you listeners if you are brand new customers. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first order at drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/LockedOnNHL for 40% off your first order. drinktrade.com/LockedOnNHL. Go get yourself a fresh cuppa. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about, the upcoming trade deadline and what it is that, Winnipeg may be going after. And I think it's been, a little bit of a tricky process. I think, the Jets have a lot of resources to pull from, but we're in a very competitive market. We're in a very real situation where players with no movement and no trade clauses are a little bit harder to fish out. And, I just feel like the Jets may be thinking that they're better than they are. And I kind of worry about that. I think the Jets, for what it's worth, are a very good team. I think that they are very clearly one of the top Stanley Cup contenders. But the problem for Winnipeg is that when it comes to the playoffs, Winnipeg's lack of elite talent at times has been a real situational issue, especially against a team like Colorado or Vegas, right? They've got speed and skill to burn up and down their lineup. And even if they don't have like the craziest skill depth, they've built their team to be fast enough to cause Winnipeg serious problems. So for me, this year for the Jets really has to be a major swing. I've talked about it many times before. This trade deadline has to be one of the biggest in Winnipeg history. And I think it will be. I think the Jets are going to go after some really big pieces. I don't think that they're going to just settle for depth. And the definition of depth that Chevy may be going for might not be how a lot of us see it, right? We often talk about depth as third and fourth liners, but the quality of depth may be more in the Monahan and Toffoli tier, which if that's what Chevy is shooting for, you will get some really good players out of that. I think they also probably recognize that foot speed was a real problem last year, so hopefully they kind of avoid that this season. Nick Lynham from Top Line Media posted a brief little list of players who perhaps haven't exactly been discussed as major trade targets, at least a couple of them, but don't have any sort of trade protection. We're talking about Jason Zucker, Ryan McLeod, Tommy Novak, Matthew Joseph, and Connor Garland. Now, the most interesting name for me personally is Tommy Novak. You've heard me talk about Novak before. He scored a great power play goal yesterday. Novak is a center who's got a couple of seasons, of term here, and he's just a really good middle six player who probably gives your second line enough skill to be an improvement on Nemesnikov. Nemesnikov as a fourth liner, I think, is awesome. As a second liner, I just worry a little bit about the ability to drive offense. I think that there's a lot that he does right, but you often see him kind of handle the puck like a hand grenade. So offensively, that's where I think his game kind of maybe lacks a little bit. Novak could kind of come in and immediately be an improvement there. Ryan McLeod could probably do something like that. I'm a little bit less interested in McLeod just because it's kind of like getting another Lowry. And while I do love Lowry and I think he plays a really vital role for this team, I think the Jets need to find somebody with a bit more finishing talent. McLeod does kind of do some of that. It's just not at a level that I think I'm looking for. I want like top 6 offensive production, which is going to be a little bit harder to find. Now, the reason that a McLeod might be of particular interest is because apparently JJ Peterka might be on the trade block, and if the Sabres are really moving Peterka, I would very much be going after that. Right? We all know that Nick Ehlers probably isn't coming back next year. I think the longer that this whole silence on his contract situation goes, the more I feel that he wants greener pastures. And I don't blame him. I think the Jets have misused him for many years. I think it's probably depressed his wage earnings. Unless Winnipeg kind of really wows him with a big offer and he feels drawn enough to the city personally to want to stick around, I kind of feel like he and his agent are going to hit the high roads. Again, I could be wrong about this. That's just sort of the vibe I get. And you need an insurance plan. Peterka definitely does that. And honestly, if the Sabres do trade him, I kind of feel like they're making a huge mistake. But the Sabres are one of those teams that just feels like it should be better than it is, but for some reason, they're legally not allowed to be good. So Winnipeg, if they're targeting players in this tier of so-called depth forward, you're going to get middle to top 6 production at a bigger cost cut, than perhaps some of the most top-end names. But Garland is of interest. I think he'd be great on the third line alongside Lowry. McLeod could perhaps provide another sort of matchup center. Zucker is skilled, perhaps somebody who can bring, a nice finishing touch, although that's not really been his game for his career. He's always a really good setup player. Joseph, I don't really have that much interest in him. He's an okay third or fourth line guy, and that's basically it. So, I'm curious to know that I'm curious to know what the Jets are after here, right? I feel like a defender is going to be a must, but on the forward side, Winnipeg could go any number of directions. And I have a hard time trying to gauge this market. I feel like the prices are going to be high for centers, but maybe the Jets can bring in an elite winger and get a bit of a discount. But let me know who you think the Jets are going to trade for, which packages are most interesting to you. Is there anyone on this list of no trade, no movement clauses that's of particular curiosity? Drop your thoughts below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Next week, we will talk about Winnipeg versus the Flyers and hopefully come away with a major victory. But like I said, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night and go Jets go.